As the autumn rain drizzles, Andriy loads his car with humanitarian supplies. He's now the only help getting through to the frontline villages in this part of Cherson region.
They saw it. I had a folder with some document there. Everything I had was there. Look, you see, they were throwing it. And that's what they forgot? Oh, I don't want even to touch it.
Slowjansk, der Ort in der Ostukraine, der bereits 2014 vorübergehend von pro-russischen Separatisten unter Kontrolle gebracht wurde. Der Ort, an dem nicht wenige Menschen durchaus russlandfreundlich waren. Auch dorthin ist der Krieg mit dem Großangriff auf die gesamte Ukraine zurückgekehrt und hat alles verändert. Auch bei denjenigen, die seinerzeit eher pro-russisch waren. Wassili Golod und Rebecca Barth berichten.
Now to Ukraine, where the mayor of the country's capital, Kyiv, has asked residents to make preparations to leave in case there is a total collapse of power supplies. Vitaly Klitschko accused Russia of doing everything possible to deprive the city of heat, electricity and water.
Well, I'm joined now by retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell to discuss all of this. Let's touch on this admission now by Iran that they have been supplying drones to Russia. I guess it was suspected for a while, but why are they admitting it all of a sudden?
Torture, filtration camps and mass graves. With each settlement deoccupied by the Ukrainian army, the world learns about new victims of Russian soldiers.
Since the beginning of the deoccupation, the police in the Donetsk, Kharkiv and Kherson regions have found the bodies of 868 civilians, 24 of them are children.
Der russische Präsident, der scheint auf den Winter zu setzen, auf eine zerstörte Infrastruktur in der Ukraine und eine nachlassende Hilfsbereitschaft außerhalb. Darauf, dass die Menschen sich spalten lassen, weil die Situation angesichts der drastisch gestiegenen Preise für alle unangenehmer wird. Polen hat als Nachbarland der Ukraine besonders viele Geflüchtete aufgenommen. Auch dort wird das Leben teurer. Viele Geflüchtete leben in Sammelunterkünften oder sind noch zu Gast in Privathaushalten. Eine eigene Wohnung ist meistens nicht drin, denn gutes Geld zu verdienen, das ist gar nicht so einfach, wie Christine Joachim berichtet.
Italian villas of Vladimir Solovyov, elite Moscow apartments of Popov and Skabeva, luxury cars and global brands of Simonyan. For fooling the Russians, the Kremlin generously presents propagandists, salaries of millions rubles and bonuses, a share in state-owned companies. All this from the valley of taxpayers. After all, propagandists receive money for their service from the state budget.
The soundtrack is loud and the guns are loaded. These men are preparing for battle in eastern Ukraine, and they've traveled a long way to get here. They're foreign fighters with a single aim: to defeat the Russians in combat.
Killing is not easy for a human. We are human. Russians not a normal human.
Not a hindrance to mobilization and mental disorders. 31-year-old Semyon Lezhanin from Tyumen was called up after a month of treatment in the regional psychiatric hospital. He was admitted to the hospital with a suspicion of severe depression, but during treatment the man was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia.
My flat, as you see, it still doesn't have even a door.
Alexei Morozov is looking to the future, one where a treasured past in this apartment will be rebuilt.
Of course, it was not a flat, it was a big hall here, and with lots of dust and lots of glasses around.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Iran of lying and terrorist cooperation by supporting Russia's war in Ukraine. It comes after Tehran admitted it had supplied drones to Moscow, but insisted there was no evidence they'd been deployed in the conflict. The West believes Russia has used the drones to hit key infrastructure targets in Ukraine. Sylvia Lennon-Spence has the story.
Dear Ukrainians, I wish you health. On November 5th, I held another meeting of the staff of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. It was quite long, 3 hours. We analyzed the situation on the front line in great detail, in all directions, on the energy front, the situation on the borders. The Commander-in-Chief, Commanders, Head of Intelligence, Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, Head of Border Guards delivered reports. We know what the enemy is preparing for. We will respond and continue to liberate our land.
As the autumn rain drizzles, Andriy loads his car with humanitarian supplies. He's now the only help getting through to the frontline villages in this part of Cherson region.
It's very dangerous because artillery of Russian is very stupid because it bombing anywhere. It don't bombing only soldiers.
It's all over the place.
Yes.
His journey takes him across flat, open roads, fields of what should have been watermelons, and now the boggy terrain of this conflict. This is only possible when the shelling stops. When he arrives in Duchany, villagers quickly emerge to meet him. The war here is getting worse, and so is the suffering.
Чоловіка вбили ракетою, прилетіла ракета і стріляли. І все хазяйство, всі вівці, корови, яке було, все мертве. Спеціально побили.
What Andriy hands out will be the only supplies they get here until he can get through to this place again.
Yesterday, four people died.
4 people were killed in this village.
On the street.
The seesaw fighting here in the south of Ukraine, like everywhere else, is taking an enormous toll. Most people have fled, their homes left in ruins, creating a huge refugee crisis in the heart of Europe. The frontline towns and villages along the southern front have all been pounded continuously by Russian artillery. Here, nearly every building has been hit by Russian shelling. But Ukrainian forces are telling us that they do now have momentum in the fight for Cherson. But for those caught in the crossfire, this conflict remains extremely destructive. At the center of the fighting is the occupied city of Cherson, where there are signs the Kremlin may be losing. The Russian flag taken down from the administrative building and checkpoints abandoned overnight. Is it a sign of retreat or an act of deception? Private Yuri covers his face. His family is still trapped in occupied territory. He's confident Ukraine can and will win, but not without enormous sacrifice.
The shelling actually has increased in the past several days. So the civilians are struggling. I spoke to like 5 people from the village of Zolota Balka this morning, and it's been the hardest since the beginning of war, they say, and it's only like 15 kilometers away. So the troops are advancing, but the battles are as hard as they go, and people are suffering.
But for all the progress, the conditions for civilians are becoming unbearable. Russia is targeting energy and water infrastructure in a cruel escalation. The damage in many places too great to fix before winter arrives. It is the people that are being made to suffer. Alex Rossi, Sky News, in the Cherson region.
They saw it. I had a folder with some document there. Everything I had was there. Look, you see, they were throwing it. And that's what they forgot? Oh, I don't want even to touch it.
Lyudmila, a resident of the village of Drobisheve, near liberated Lyman, shows what has been preserved: a Ukrainian flag and a Ukrainian embroidery shirt, vyshivanka. The Russian occupiers forced her to leave her own house. They lived there for 2 weeks.
Well, it turned out this way. I have a 2-story house there and the end of the vegetable garden. I had everything there, electricity and heating, and I had a bomb shelter in the basement. Pensioners lived there. So I had to cook at home and then I had to carry it there. Well, I brought dinner, and while we were eating, my neighbors came in and said, "They are already taking over your house."
Lyudmila remembers that during the counteroffensive by Ukrainian forces, the Russian occupiers escaped from the settlement by disguising themselves in civilian clothing back on the move.
They were people from Luhansk, they were the electricians, and then over 2 days there was already Russia. Right here, tank was standing and the birds had dropped them a gift.
The neighboring village of Novoselivka was also under Russian occupation for more than 3 months. The 72-year-old Alexandra says that the Russian soldiers did not touch the women, but they detained the men and forced them to undress. They searched for patriotic tattoos on their bodies.
I have a neighbor. She stayed in my house. She has a 21-year-old boy. They told him to undress, and he undressed. And they told him one to undress too, and he undressed. As soon as he got dressed, they told him to undress again. He said, "I just got undressed."
Angela, a resident of Liberated Lyman, lived with her husband in the basement of a damaged house for several months. She says she has been sick all the time after spending a long time in the damp place.
Getting sick, freezing. Are you? Sure, you have to wash laundry in cold water, wash dishes when you freeze and get cold. Are you used to that kind of life? It is difficult. Well, you know, I am already indifferent. Suddenly want to have electricity and heating in the apartment. I'm already tired of this basement. First you enter there clean, then you return with dirty hands, dirty face. Well, the electricity is promised. Well, yes, they say a couple of days and they will provide it to our house.
Electricity has already been supplied to several residential areas in Lyman. The gas supply in the de-occupied territories has not yet been restored, because the gas pipeline was damaged by Russian shells. Only in Lyman, about 80% of both residential and utility infrastructure has been destroyed or damaged. Reported by Roman Smoler, Olena Hramova, UATV News.
Slowjansk, der Ort in der Ostukraine, der bereits 2014 vorübergehend von pro-russischen Separatisten unter Kontrolle gebracht wurde. Der Ort, an dem nicht wenige Menschen durchaus russlandfreundlich waren. Auch dorthin ist der Krieg mit dem Großangriff auf die gesamte Ukraine zurückgekehrt und hat alles verändert. Auch bei denjenigen, die seinerzeit eher pro-russisch waren. Wassili Golod und Rebecca Barth berichten.
Slowjansk im Osten der Ukraine, eines der Hauptziele des russischen Angriffs. Einst lebten hier 100.000 Menschen. Vor mehr als 8 Jahren wurde diese Stadt weltberühmt. Hier hat 2014 alles angefangen. Besatzung, Folter und Mord. Der russische Krieg gegen die Ukraine. Damals war noch die Rede von sogenannten pro-russischen Separatisten. 2014 wurde die Stadt unter russischer Federführung über einige Monate besetzt. Unbekannte Kämpfer übernehmen das Rathaus. Inzwischen wird dieses Rathaus wieder ukrainisch regiert. Wadim Lyach war damals Abgeordneter, saß für eine pro-russische Partei im Stadtrat. Heute hat er als Bürgermeister die Fenster seines Büros mit Aktenbergen verbarrikadiert und schließt eine Verhandlungslösung mit Russland kategorisch aus.
Weil Verhandlungen nur eine Atempause für Russland sind. Schon 2014 hat Russland gezeigt, dass sie nicht nur 3-4 Regionen annektieren wollen. Russland will die gesamte Ukraine. Deshalb kann es nur eine militärische Lösung geben und erst dann Verhandlungen.
Aktuell ist es in Slowjansk gespenstisch still. Die russische Armee kommt seit Monaten nicht voran, wurde sogar zurückgedrängt. Und trotzdem hat Russland hier viel zerstört. Ganze Häuser, aber auch Stromleitungen.
Es gibt nach dem Beschuss manchmal Probleme mit der Stromversorgung und auch mit der Wasserversorgung. Das hängt damit zusammen, dass die Elektroinfrastruktur rund um die Stadt praktisch zerstört ist.
Etwa 1/4 der Einwohner ist in Slowjansk geblieben. Viele haben zu wenig Geld, um einkaufen zu gehen. Einige verkaufen Lebensmittel, die sie in ihren heimischen Gärten angebaut haben. In der städtischen Kirche machen sie mehr, als nur zu beten. Granaten, Patronenhülsen, Raketenteile. Seit Jahren sammelt Pfarrer Petro Dudnik all das, was von den russischen Angriffen übrig bleibt. Und er macht sich Gedanken darüber, wie es in Slowjansk weitergehen soll.
Ich würde meine Frau und meine Kinder jetzt nicht zurückholen wollen, weil das wirklich gefährlich ist. Aber es kommen Leute wieder. Die zweite Herausforderung ist der Winter. Niemand weiß, ob das Gas in die Rohre kommt und deshalb fragen sich die Leute, wie sie überwintern.
Petro Dudnik will dafür sorgen, dass möglichst viele Menschen in der Region darauf vorbereitet sind, dass sie es im Winter warm haben. Wärme in jedes Haus heißt sein Projekt. 150 € kostet eine Burjuika. Für diese Miniöfen sammelt Dudnik gerade Geld.
Hier kommt das Holz rein. Ein ganz einfacher Kamin. Dann wird es angezündet. Hier kannst du einen Teekessel oder Topf mit heißem Wasser hinstellen, also Essen kochen und gleichzeitig Kaminwärme bekommen.
Warme Kleidung, Kerzen, Streichhölzer, sagt der Pfarrer, seien gerade das Wichtigste für die Menschen in der Ostukraine. Für Menschen wie Lyubov. Ihr hat er persönlich einen Miniofen vorbeigebracht. Wir besuchen Lyubov, die seit Monaten im Keller lebt. Weil sie Angst hat, dass der Beschuss jederzeit wieder anfangen kann, traut sie sich nur noch selten nach oben. Hier unten pflegt sie auch ihre Mutter. Wir leben von humanitärer Hilfe und von der Rente, die Oma bekommt. So kommen wir über die Runden. Und der Garten. Wir haben spät, aber noch rechtzeitig gepflanzt, konnten uns so ein bisschen eindecken. Und dank der Kirche. Ich weiß nicht, wie wir es ohne sie geschafft hätten. 2014 hatte Lyubov noch die Hoffnung, dass dieser Krieg ein schnelles Ende findet. Die russische Invasion zwingt ihnen nun ein Leben im Ausnahmezustand auf. Schlafen im Keller, Holzsägen für die Wärme. Wir haben ohne das alles gelebt. Und jetzt brauchen wir das Holz zum Heizen. Wenn wir nicht heizen, wird Oma erfrieren. Wir werden erfrieren. Deshalb müssen wir das alles machen. Die Menschen in Slowjansk stellen sich auf einen schweren Winter ein. Wann der russische Angriffskrieg enden könnte, darüber wagen sie hier, wo alles seinen Anfang nahm, keine Prognosen.
Now to Ukraine, where the mayor of the country's capital, Kyiv, has asked residents to make preparations to leave in case there is a total collapse of power supplies. Vitaly Klitschko accused Russia of doing everything possible to deprive the city of heat, electricity and water. Well, estimates suggest that around 40% of Ukraine's energy system has been damaged or destroyed in Russian attacks targeting vital infrastructure. The mayor urged the capital's 3 million remaining residents to make contingency plans to relocate.
Путіну ми, українці, не потрібні.
Putin doesn't need us Ukrainians. He needs territory. He needs Ukraine without us. That's why everything that is happening now is genocide. His task is for us to die, to freeze, or to make us flee our land so that he can have it.
Я також звертаюсь для людей прорахувати, якщо у вас є.
I also want to urge Kyiv residents to consider everything. In the worst case, if we are left without electricity and water, if you have extended family or friends outside Kyiv who have their own water supply, an oven or heating, please keep in mind the possibility of staying there for a certain amount of time.
Vitaly Klitschko there, the mayor of Kyiv. Let's cross over live to Kyiv because Catherine Byaruhanga, my colleague, joins us live now. Catherine, it's a stark wake-up call, isn't it, when you've got Vitaly Klitschko saying something like this?
Yes, the former heavyweight boxing champion there speaking to the residents of his city, urging them to now start thinking about the possibility that you might have a total power failure in Kyiv. I'm speaking to you from the capital, which has been experiencing continuous rolling blackouts. It's approaching the depth of winter. As I speak to you right now, it's 6 degrees, but sometimes the temperature here can get to minus 20 degrees. And obviously the concern is what happens to residents here in the capital should there be further Russian missile strikes attacking the power infrastructure in the country that could then lead to a total failure. So we heard there from the mayor of Kyiv urging residents to start thinking about reaching out to friends, family who live outside the city, start to make plans to be able to go out and live with them temporarily whilst they try to get the power back online.
And Catherine, what is then, therefore, the mood in the capital? Because the resolve and the resilience of the Ukrainian people, especially those in Kyiv, has been very visible throughout this war since the 24th of February. But with this kind of warning from the mayor himself of the capital, it's difficult here.
I think what we're seeing is a level of preparation from people in Kiev. I've been speaking to some of the residents this evening, and some of them are telling me that we understand that the situation is serious. We know that there is a possibility that we could lose power completely. And so for the last few weeks, they've started making preparations. So one of the things that they're doing is stocking up on things like fuel for generators. They're also getting extra food, extra water, really preparing for what could be a bitter winter. But we also heard from one resident who said, I have children, I have elderly parents, so I've already started buying power generators, started to make preparations to move my family out of the city centre in case things get worse.
And Catherine, the mayor there was also talking about that this is a campaign, he used the word genocide, the elimination of the Ukrainian people. It's incredibly strong language that Vitaly Klitschko is using here.
It is incredibly strong. You know, we've heard from Ukrainian officials and Ukrainians in the past describing this war as a genocide. But, you know, on the whole, what they are trying to point to is that really the Russian onslaught has been bitter. It has been terrible for the people here. And when you think about targeting power infrastructure, that has real consequences for families, especially families with elderly people, with children. A lot of people came back to Ukraine hoping, especially to places like Kiev, hoping that things could be better now that, you know, the Russians have been pushed further away from the city centre. There's a real prospect that the winter could be tough for them because they won't be able to keep warm, or they'll find it hard to get water or to feed themselves. What the city mayor has also talked about is that they're going to install 1,000 heating points around Kiev. And the idea is that should there be power failures, power shutdowns, Kievites, people in the capital, can go to these heating points to try and stay warm through this winter.
And that will be necessary as those temperatures drop. Catherine, Byaruhanga and the team in Kiev, stay safe. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm joined now by retired Air Marshal Sean Bell to discuss all of this. Let's touch on this admission now by Iran that they have been supplying drones to Russia. I guess it was suspected for a while, but why are they admitting it all of a sudden?
Yeah, it's worth a bit of background. The last couple of weeks, we've been reporting the widespread targeting of critical national infrastructure by Russia of Ukraine using the Shahed 136 drones, which Iran at the time said they have not provided to the Russians. Yet the Iranians now have admitted they have provided them, but have qualified that, saying they've provided them a couple of months before the start of the war. That's all part of Iran trying to position itself not to take sides in this. Russia's used about 300 of these drones so far, but it needs another couple of hundred by all accounts, and it's also looking for Iranian support to provide other missiles, potentially surface-to-air missile systems. But returning to your question of why now, it does appear that Iran is seeking to exploit this Russian dependency on it for weapons and seeking to create a more bilateral, more equal partnership relationship with Russia. What's interesting, I think, is Russia desperately needs the weapons. What is it that Iran's seeking? And it's widely reported now that Iran is actually looking for help with its fledgling nuclear program. And if that's true, that's a very worrying development.
Let's move on to the latest situation on the ground here in Ukraine. Break it down for us.
Yeah, so in Cherson, we've been talking a lot about Cherson. President Putin's announced that he's trying to get civilians evacuated out of the city. Is that a precursor to a bigger withdrawal, or is that preparing for fighting? The honest answer is we don't know. But it's worth reminding viewers that from a Ukrainian perspective, they'd be really reluctant to fight their way into Cherson. That would be an incredibly difficult and dangerous undertaking. Probably what they're trying to do at the moment is to isolate the tens of thousands of Russian troops that are trapped in Cherson. They've blown the bridges over the Dnipro River and cause a real logistics challenge for Russia supplying those forces potentially as the winter goes on. From a military analyst perspective, we still generally believe that Russia will withdraw, but probably a fighting withdrawal to stop the Ukrainians turning it into a rout. In Donetsk is the other region we're looking at massive fighting by the Russians. It's about the only part of the country where the Russians are on the front foot and pushing really hard. If you look at the Luhansk region up the north there, that's already owned and occupied by the Russians. Donetsk, though, there's a huge white area there that the Russians haven't yet got. The Russians are pushing everything at that attack. The Ukrainians said there were 80 attacks in one day mounted, which is a huge effort, massive casualties, almost certainly from the Russian side to do that. Why? Because it appears that there's a desperate effort by the Russians to try to take that before the winter period. It's part of Putin's special military operation.
And talk us through the latest on the Russian forces, Sean, because they've obviously been trying to get the numbers up. How's that going and what's the sort of status at the moment?
Yeah, it's really interesting. They've been focused on quantity but not on quality. They had this partial mobilisation to get 300,000 troops. In addition to that, they've now got another 120,000 they're trying to source, which is the annual requirement for Russia to generate replacements for its conscript army. The challenge is who does the training for these military folks, because all the trainers are actually at war at the moment. So they're doing it up in Belarus up to the north. Belarus is not known well for its international defence training, so those troops are hitting the battle really badly trained. We've talked a lot about this training and why it's important. Good example came out overnight. Russian military commander in the Donbass, Alexander Khodorkovsky, claimed that 60% of the Russian casualties in the Donbass were caused by friendly fire. Now, although friendly fire is an issue for any military, it's normally fractions of a percent, maybe 2 or 3%. To see it at 5%, even if that's been grossly exaggerated, is a dreadful indictment of the Russian military training. Why is that happening? They've had several generals replaced. They've got lots of ill-trained, ill-equipped forces in place, and they've got a mix of forces and their mercenary forces, and they're bad communication, bad command and control, bad coordination. Whatever the challenges, though, this is not going to be an easy thing for the Russians to fix.
Sean Bell, as always, thanks so much.
Torture, filtration camps and mass graves. With each settlement deoccupied by the Ukrainian army, the world learns about new victims of Russian soldiers.
Since the beginning of the deoccupation, the police in the Donetsk, Kharkiv and Kherson regions have found the bodies of 868 civilians, 24 of them are children, which is another confirmation of the fact that Russia is actually carrying out the genocide of the Ukrainian people. In the deoccupied areas of these regions, police investigators have already documented 2,670 war crimes.
Oleg, a resident of the village of Kozachya Lopan in the Kharkiv region, managed to survive after 8 days of being beaten by Russian soldiers. Man says 24 soldiers drove into his courtyard on an armored personal carrier. Oleg, his son and nephew were forced into a car, blindfolded and taken away in an unknown direction.
They put me in some kind of car, because I didn't see anything further, and they brought me to the basement. As it turned out later, it was the Kozachya Lopan railway station. Tied the hands like this, hung up, started beating. They didn't ask many questions, the reason for the beating, the reason for everything. They only asked why I didn't fight for the Donetsk or Luhansk People's Republics in 2014. You didn't care, it didn't matter.
The Russian invaders demanded an answer to their questions. Did Oleg participated in the anti-terrorist operation and later in the operation of the joint forces in Donbass? When the Russian military realized that they would not learn anything by force, they turned to blackmail.
They saw that they can't achieve anything this way, and they said that they will bring my 17-year-old daughter, untie my eyes and rape her right here altogether. And it will be on my conscience, but thank God they didn't do it.
The Ukrainian language, the presence of state symbols, the flag or coat of arms of Ukraine, service in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine are the reasons for torture, beatings, interrogations and killing of civilians by Russian soldiers. Experts say that this is one of the proofs that the army of the Russian Federation is committing genocide of Ukrainians on a national basis.
There are, let's say, irrefutable facts proving that those who speak Russian and Ukrainian in the same settlement have different fates. They are treated by the occupiers in a different way, and so we received signals about that in one of the villages of the Kyiv region, where a small number of people spoke Ukrainian. They were subjected to, let's say, terror, and some of them were killed.
Evidence of the genocide of the civilian population in the de-occupied territories is being collected by Ukrainian law enforcement officers and prosecutors of the International Criminal Court. The main thing, experts say, is to document the intention of the Russian military, the destruction of Ukrainians as a nation.
In order to prove the facts of genocide, it is necessary to prove the intentions of those intruders, criminals, not just about the massacre of civilians, but precisely the intention to carry out genocide against, in this case, the national group of Ukrainians. And here it is very important to analyze the context, in particular what is happening in the Russian media space, those calls for the destruction of Ukrainians that are heard, and the policy of the Russian Federation, which is aimed at erasing the identity of the Ukrainian people, can also be an element of genocide.
The crime of genocide has no statute of limitations. Therefore, the Russian military who committed this crime in Ukraine and returned to the territory of the Russian Federation can be held accountable.
This may be a sentence that will be handed down in absentia and will include a system or international jurisdiction and the involvement of states that can use their territory as an opportunity for these Russian criminals convicted by Ukrainian courts to be on it. Or it could be, if there is a proper end to the war, coercion of Russia to extradition of these criminals who will be on the territory of Russia, for either bringing them to court or serving their sentence already in Ukraine.
Reported by Roman Smoler, Larissa Zubenko, UATV News.
Der russische Präsident, der scheint auf den Winter zu setzen, auf eine zerstörte Infrastruktur in der Ukraine und eine nachlassende Hilfsbereitschaft außerhalb. Darauf, dass die Menschen sich spalten lassen, weil die Situation angesichts der drastisch gestiegenen Preise für alle unangenehmer wird. Polen hat als Nachbarland der Ukraine besonders viele Geflüchtete aufgenommen. Auch dort wird das Leben teurer. Viele Geflüchtete leben in Sammelunterkünften oder sind noch zu Gast in Privathaushalten. Eine eigene Wohnung ist meistens nicht drin, denn gutes Geld zu verdienen, das ist gar nicht so einfach, wie Christine Joachim berichtet.
Ukrainische Frauen auf einer Bühne in Sapsche, eine Stadt in Oberschlesien. Sie spielen sich selbst, ihre Geschichte, die Geschichte ihrer Flucht und ihrer Ankunft hier in Polen.
Ihr Polen, ihr habt uns alles gegeben, von Hosen bis zum Dach über dem Kopf.
Dankbarkeit für die Hilfsbereitschaft, auf die sie hier alle getroffen sind. Auch das Theaterprojekt ist so eine Art Hilfe zur Selbsthilfe. Die Frauen bekommen ein bisschen Geld und sie können den Polen etwas zurückgeben über die Kunst.
Ich war noch nie in so einer Situation, wo dir jemand einfach so Dinge umsonst gibt. Das ist wirklich schwer für mich, weil man anfängt, sich selbst zu bemitleiden. Und dieses Gefühl der Dankbarkeit gegenüber den Polen, das führt dazu, dass ich mich auf der Bühne immer sehr zusammenreißen muss, um nicht zu weinen.
Ksenia kam im März aus Kiew nach Sapsche und ist nur durch Zufall in das Theaterprojekt geraten. In der Ukraine war sie im Filmbusiness, meistens hinter der Kamera, aber manchmal auch davor. Sie hatte ein gutes Leben vor dem Krieg. Um ihren Sohn in Sicherheit zu bringen, ist sie nach Polen gekommen. Ihr Mann musste in der Ukraine bleiben. Mit dem Sohn lebt sie jetzt zusammen in einem Zimmer in einer Sammelunterkunft. 500 Zloty Kindergeld, rund 100 € bekommt sie vom polnischen Staat, wie alle Ukrainer. Die Unterkunft ist kostenlos. Für eine eigene Wohnung reicht das Geld nicht.
Es würde nicht funktionieren. Ich habe es durchgerechnet. Ich habe keine Hilfe mit dem Kind und die Miete für eine Einzimmerwohnung wäre mit dem Mindestlohn, den ich hier wegen meiner fehlenden Sprachkenntnisse nur verdienen würde, viel zu teuer. Ich könnte dann keine Lebensmittel mehr kaufen.
Wie Ksenia leben ungefähr 80.000 der nach Polen geflüchteten Ukrainer kostenlos in Sammelunterkünften, die meisten mit wesentlich weniger Komfort als hier. Doch die Regierung plant, dass sich Geflüchtete, die sich länger als 120 Tage im Land aufhalten, ab nächstem Jahr zur Hälfte an den Kosten beteiligen müssen. Auch das wäre aber für Ksenia noch günstiger als eine eigene Wohnung. Die allermeisten sind ohnehin privat untergekommen, bei Bekannten, Familie oder bei hilfsbereiten Polen. Dieses Glück hatte auch Tatjana. Sie wohnt seit April mit ihrer Tochter Mira bei Maja in Warschau. Und darüber sind beide auch sehr froh, auch wenn es nicht immer ganz leicht ist.
Wir leben ja schon eine ganze Weile bei Maja. Und manchmal denke ich, was ist, wenn ich irgendetwas mache, womit sie sich unwohl fühlt? Wenn sie mal allein sein will. Ich will doch immer, dass sie weiß, dass ich das Beste für sie will, in ihrem eigenen Heim. Dass sie sich gut mit uns fühlt.
Aber Maja sagt, es geht ihnen gut zusammen in ihrer WG. Die beiden Frauen würden ohnehin sehr viel arbeiten und sehen sich meist nur am Abend. Seit kurzem beteiligt sich Tatjana auch an den Kosten. Es wäre nicht nötig gewesen, sagt Maja. Aber Tatjana wollte es so.
Jetzt fühlen wir uns beide zuständig, so als ob wir beide hier zu Hause wären. Ich hoffe, dieses Gefühl hilft Tatjana. Wir bemühen uns wirklich.
Geld verdient Tatjana in einer Näherei für Lederwaren. Genäht hat sie schon in der Ukraine Hochzeitskleider. Die Hürde zum Arbeitsmarkt hier in Polen war niedrig, weil die Regierung den Zugang gleich zu Beginn des Krieges extrem erleichtert hatte. Vor allem einfache Jobs. Viel Geld kommt dabei nicht rum. Umgerechnet 700 € verdient Tatjana, zu wenig für eine eigene Wohnung, zumal die wenigen günstigen in den Anzeigen oft nur für Polen angeboten werden.
Man freut sich erst. Endlich etwas, was ich mir leisten kann. Und dann liest man weiter und sieht, nur für Polen. Ich verstehe ja, dass sich die Leute Sorgen machen, dass etwas kaputt gehen könnte oder man die Miete nicht zahlen kann. Aber das kann ja bei jedem Mieter passieren.
Die Hilfsbereitschaft hat auch in Polen ihre Grenzen. Gerade jetzt, wo die Inflation die Preise treibt, die Energiekosten explodieren. Das spürt auch Tatjana.
Ja, es hat sich verändert. Die Zeit verändert alles. Die Polen werden müde von diesem Zustand. Das kann alles nicht ewig so weitergehen, aber es gibt noch Hilfe und das ist gut.
Aber Tatjana und Mira wollen trotzdem, sobald es geht, zurück in die Ukraine, selbst wenn der Krieg noch nicht vorbei sein sollte. Und auch für Ksenia und die anderen Frauen auf der Bühne in Sapsche ist es keine Perspektive, dauerhaft auf die Hilfe der Polen angewiesen zu sein.
Wir sind den Polen sehr dankbar. Aber vielen von uns, das weiß ich, ging es zu Hause sehr gut. Wir hatten gute Jobs, alles war okay. Wir waren alle verheiratet. Es ist ein bisschen so, als würden unsere Leben gerade eine Pause machen.
Es ist eine Pause ohne erkennbares Ende.
Italian villas of Vladimir Solovyov, elite Moscow apartments of Popov and Skabeyeva, luxury cars and global brands of Simonyan. For fooling the Russians, the Kremlin generously presents propagandists. Salaries of millions rubles and bonuses, a share in state-owned companies. All this from the valley of taxpayers. After all, propagandists receive money for their service from the state budget. However, they don't announce the amount. The annual income of the married couple of propagandists Skabeyeva and Popov was found out when Popov went to the State Duma and published his declaration.
Popov's income is about 18 million rubles a year. Skabeyeva has 15. Popov still has a deputy allowance. As a deputy, several million. As a TV propagandist, he earns more than a deputy. Found out how much Vladimir Solovyov earns. Only his personal income is more than 200 million rubles a year.
And these are pre-war salaries. It is possible that now the Kremlin pays more to the talking heads of Russian TV. Indeed, even under the conditions of sanctions, they are not ready to demonstrate asceticism. Here Margarita Simonyan talks about the decaying West and the impoverished Europe, dressed from luxury Western brands. The cost of one of these is 2,000 euros, according to the current official Russian exchange rate. This is more than 120,000 rubles. To acquire such a dress, a teacher from Tuva with a salary of 12,000 rubles would have to save 10 months. True, she would no longer have to eat, be treated and use public services. Economists talk about the widening gap between rich and poor Russians after the beginning of a full-scale war against Ukraine. It even benefits the Kremlin. After all, it is easier to send poor people to war, promising good salaries, which you don't have to pay.
Putin said that the mobilized would be paid 190,000. The boys got 2,000 or 4,000 on the card. Sit under bullets for 4,000 a day, not day, per month. You'd rather die of hunger than be killed.
The mobilized from Chuvashia did not wait for their money and came out to protest. The fact that they go to the war in Ukraine to earn money, the Russian military does not hide. In the distorting mirror of Russian propaganda, the picture is quite different. Their selfless heroes give their lives for the ideas of the leader.
Propagandists bear the same responsibility. Without their activity, the events in which we have been living for at least the last year would not have been possible. This is an integral part of the war. This is not media, this is not journalism. This is part of the military machine of the Russian Federation which it uses.
Incitement of hatred and calls for genocide are part of the crimes of Russian propagandists.
Articles on public manifestations of calls for genocide can be applied to Russian propagandists. This is included into the legislation of Ukraine, as well as in the Rome Statute. And this is a crime under international law, according to the Rome Statute. The punishment for calls for genocide and crimes against humanity can be up to 30 years of imprisonment, as well as life sentence.
The Kremlin propagandists will not be able to hide from justice because these crimes do not have a statute of limitations. War criminals are caught even 20 years after being put on the wanted list. This happened to a Kremlin colleague from Rwanda. Felicien Kabuga, co-founder of the Southern Hills propaganda radio, called for ethnic hatred and instigated the 194 genocide in Rwanda. He was hiding from justice for 23 years. He was sure that he would not be found, that he would escape trial and punishment. He was wrong. Kabuga was arrested near Paris and will be judged in The Hague. Reported by Roman Smoler, Ksenia Barvinenko, UATV News.
The soundtrack is loud and the guns are loaded. These men are preparing for battle in eastern Ukraine, and they've traveled a long way to get here. They're foreign fighters with a single aim: to defeat the Russians in combat.
Killing is not easy for a human. We are human. Russians not a normal human.
They're volunteers from Georgia who serve in a unit called the Georgian Legion. It has more than 1,000 men at the front, including Misha, who says he's come to settle a score. The Russians cause problems at home.
Это общий враг. У этого врага, у этой страны оккупировано 20% моей земли. Чем их меньше останется, тем их меньше останется для нас.
Formed in 2014, the Georgian Legion is one of several international brigades now fighting for Ukraine. And their members, taking a Russian position here last month, are drawn from a variety of countries. Some 50 Britons currently serve. We met the battalion's commander.
When we choose a soldier not to have radical views, not to come here to kill somebody. We need them to protect somebody, not to kill somebody.
Some of the people who come are adventurers.
We don't accept adventurers. We don't accept, Nazis, racists, or.
Do you reject?
Of course, we rejected a lot of people.
A lot.
I mean, I would say we rejected more than 70% of who applied to Georgian Legion.
Back on the mission, Misha and his team prepare to strike, assembling a mortar behind an abandoned house. A hit-and-run deployment, they worked at speed, trying to avoid detection by the Russians. Everyone was worried about the enemy. When the drone pilot found the target, the unit began to fire. 10 shells in 20 minutes. Each detonation monitored by the drone. The Georgians say they struck a command post, around 75% destroyed, but they knew their attack would reveal our location, and we waited for the sound of Russian fire. Sickening feeling. We've fired 8-9 shells, and now we're waiting for the Russian response. We heard the thud of Russian shells, landing in a nearby field. But Misha said it wasn't time to panic.
А вот этот разрыв, это что было? Оттуда. Привет. Ищут, щупают.
A few minutes later, the decision was made. It was time to leave our position, and we left as swiftly as we had arrived.
Got to get out of here quickly.
I asked the unit leader if the danger had passed. When will you start to relax?
Вот когда я сниму каску, вот тогда будет безопасно.
His commander, Mamuka, says he won't relax. The Georgian seeks the destruction of Vladimir Putin's regime.
I was trying to learn the alternative way, but it doesn't work with Russia, so it becomes senseless. So that there was not agreement that Russia has not broken. So naturally we have to fight. The only language Russia understands is the sound of a bullet.
Their mission completed, there was time to unwind, the relief mingling with the rap music. It's a dangerous business going to war with Russia, but there are foreign citizens who demand their say. John Sparks, Sky News, near Zaporizhia.
Delivery of summonses call to the military registration and enlistment officers sent into war. Mobilization in Russia, which is allegedly completed, continues. To remind that on October 28th, Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu announced the end of the so-called partial mobilization. According to him, 300,000 people were drafted, 82,000 were sent to the front, and problems with supplies and payments were allegedly resolved. And everything could be fine, but there is no presidential decree to end the mobilization.
Despite the Kremlin's statements about the completion of the mobilization, it should be noted that it has been transferred to a coward regime. Publicity and indicative measures have been curtailed. But along with this, the military registration and enlistment officers were instructed to continue the search and recruitment of volunteers who would express a desire to conclude a contract for participation in the so-called special military operation.
The Russian military commissars did not refuse to mobilize those who, according to official instructions, should not fall under the conscription ring. They are taken into the army with hepatitis, HIV, strabismus, a brain tumor, as well as drug and alcohol addiction.
I didn't even think that I would be mobilized. I have a bright biography. I was involved in 6 criminal articles: theft, manslaughter, beatings and death threats. Yes, he also has an alcohol addiction. He can't do without a bottle at all. Recently he went on leave and started drinking. As a result, he disappeared for a week. He was even put on the wanted list in the military unit. He was returned. Andrei Arkhipov and his wife Diana in a command for Siberia realities.
Not a hindrance to mobilization and mental disorders. 31-year-old Semyon Lezhanin from Tyumen was called up after a month of treatment in the regional psychiatric hospital. He was admitted to the hospital with a suspicion of severe depression, but during treatment the man was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia.
He is registered in the dispensary with the psychiatrist. How can one with such a diagnosis, paranoid schizophrenia, be sent to fight? I just do not understand. In this case, the category of validity D is put on the military ID. It exempts from conscription and from military duty in general. After that, I wrote statements to the military registration and enlistment office, and to the prosecutor's office, and to the public reception of the Ministry of Defense. Silence. Vera Lezhanina, mother of the mobilized Semyon Lezhanin, in a command for Siberia realities.
To compensate for losses at the front, the Russian authorities decided to mobilize the prisoners as well. Putin signed amendments to the law that allow the recruitment of people with a criminal record for serious crimes – murder, robbery, drug trafficking and so on. Only those who were convicted on charges of pedophilia as well as on terrorist and extremist articles will not be called up. This will make it possible to replenish the army with hundreds of thousands of probationers or recently released from the colonies of citizens who were previously forbidden to serve in the army. The latest decree concerns the expansion of the status of military personnel to members of volunteer formations, as well as benefits for those mobilized.
Such decrees likely indicate that Putin is preparing to continue covert mobilization in Russia by attempting to incentivize volunteer service or setting conditions to mobilize convicts. Given that he has yet to sign an order terminating mobilization as of November 4th. Provisions authorizing the mobilization of prisoners may also indicate that Putin is trying to preempt social tensions by setting conditions to mobilize convicts instead of civilian Russian men. From the report of the American Institute for the Study of War.
Probably the Russian authorities decided to use the period before the new year as an emotional relief for the population, and then to replace covert mobilization, a full-fledged second wave of conscription for war in Ukraine may come.
The war continues and is not going to end, and the people who were recruited will run out at some point. It will be necessary to supply new people, new meat for the war.
Lola Tagaeva, citing sources from the top leadership of Russia and big business, claims that work continues inside the country to eliminate errors and modernize military registration and enlistment offices. Therefore, the conclusions are obvious. Mobilization will continue. Until the end of December, a draft campaign for military service will be going on in Russia, and therefore a new wave of mobilization may begin as early as January. Reported by Serhiy Kulyas, Valeria Nekipelova, UATV News.
My flat, as you see, it still doesn't have even a door.
Alexei Morozov is looking to the future, one where a treasured past in this apartment will be rebuilt.
Of course, it was not a flat, it was a big hall here, and with lots of dust and lots of glasses around.
On the third day of the war, these images were seen around the world, a shocking demonstration that civilians in Ukraine's capital were in the firing line. Alexei and his family had moved to a nearby bomb shelter only hours earlier.
It's more strange, it's more amazing that my children asked me to move. Sorry. My boy, he's 9 years old, and he doesn't understand what does war means.
Alexei and his wife Maria lived here with their daughter and 2 sons. It was their youngest boy, Mykola, who came to them the night before the strike.
He went to our bedroom here and asked us, parents, please, let's go to the shelter, because the television tells us that it's a safe place and we have to move. And we moved.
It's extraordinary. I mean, how do you reflect on that now? I mean, that's...
Now I understand that the God exists.
The floor, peeled away and hanging in the void, was the one that supported his son's bunk bed.
So if my boys would sleep in this room this night, I'm sure, yeah.
He and his fellow residents raised tens of thousands of dollars in the days after the strike to buy supports to keep the building intact. Now the Kyiv city government is funding the reconstruction of all the affected floors.
What happened here back in February was a stark symbol of the sheer scale of the war that was coming to Ukraine. The efforts to rebuild here are, of course, pragmatic and required for those who used to live here, but they're also symbolic for a country that wants to demonstrate resilience.
Can you still visualize it in your mind, what it used to look like?
Of course, I remember how it looked.
For Alexei, there are no doubts about returning here. He wants to put his old apartment, his family's life, back together as it was.
If our angel was so strong to prevent us from this rocket, we do not scare nothing. We were scaring nothing here.
This war may be grinding on into the winter, but for Alexei and his family, an important personal victory is in sight. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, Kyiv.
Now, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Iran of lying and terrorist cooperation by supporting Russia's war in Ukraine. It comes after Tehran admitted it had supplied drones to Moscow, but insisted there was no evidence they'd been deployed in the conflict. The West believes Russia has used the drones to hit key infrastructure targets in Ukraine. Sylvia Lennon-Spence has the story.
Wave after wave of drone attacks, raining down on Ukrainian cities far away from the front lines. Russia's campaign to devastate Ukraine's power grid has left millions without electricity. It's also raised questions about the origin of the weapons being used. And after weeks of denials, Iran has finally made an admission.
The drone part is correct. We provided a limited number of drones to Russia many months prior to the Ukraine war.
Iran still claims it is neutral in the conflict, but Ukraine's President Zelensky has accused Iran of lying about the true extent of its involvement.
We shoot down at least 10 Iranian drones every day. We are certain that Iranian instructors have been teaching Russian terrorists how to use these drones, yet Tehran remains completely silent about it.
The Shahed 136 drones in question are known as kamikaze drones, named after the Japanese suicide pilots in World War II because of the way they are completely destroyed on impact. And their impact has been devastating. In just the past month, a third of Ukraine's power stations have reportedly been destroyed. As a consequence, rolling blackouts and restrictions on electricity have been imposed just as winter arrives. The US, EU and UK have all imposed sanctions on Iran, but some analysts believe Iran's leaders are willing to accept this punishment as part of a broader geopolitical strategy.
It wants to show to the Western alliances that it has the capability and it can impact beyond the region in the Middle East. They are looking for leverage over Europe and US from this drone export.
Iran has claimed that it won't remain indifferent if there is irrefutable proof of its drones being used in Ukraine. But this latest confession may only bolster the impression of Iran as a destabilizing force in global security. Sylvia Lennon-Spence, BBC News.
Dear Ukrainians, I wish you health. On November 5th, I held another meeting of the staff of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. It was quite long, 3 hours. We analyzed the situation on the front line in great detail, in all directions. On the energy front, the situation on the borders. The Commander-in-Chief, commanders, head of intelligence, Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, head of border guards delivered reports. We know what the enemy is preparing for. We will respond and continue to liberate our land. Everything related to the defense forces supply support was also analyzed. These are equipment, ammunition, communication, winter uniforms. Countermeasures against missile and drone terror were considered separately. There are already quite significant results in these. The percentage of shooting down has become higher, but there is still work to be done. We must ensure full protection of the Ukrainian sky and will continue to do everything possible and impossible for this. In the coming weeks, we expect news regarding air defense and anti-missile defense for Ukraine. By the way, on November 5th, there were messages from Iran, from official representatives. There they decided to admit that they did supply drones for Russian terror, but even in this confession, they lied. We shoot down at least 10 Iranian drones every day, and the Iranian regime claims that it allegedly gave little, and even before the start of the full-scale invasion. Only during the day of November 4th, 11 Shahed drones were destroyed. We know for sure that Iranian instructors taught Russian terrorists how to use drones, and Tehran is generally silent about it. And if Iran continues lying about the obvious, it means that the world will make even more efforts to investigate the terrorist cooperation between the Russian and Iranian regimes and what Russia is paying Iran for such cooperation. There will be no such thing in the modern world that any of terrorists or their accomplices will remain unpunished. The situation on the front line did not undergo significant changes during the day. The greatest brutality of the occupiers, as before, is focused in Donetsk region. But the constant fighting continues in other parts of the front as well. This is more than 1,000 kilometers of the line of combat clashes. I would like to pay particular attention to the National Guardsmen who defend our state in Luhansk region as part of the defense forces, in particular the soldiers of the 27th Pechersk Brigade of the National Guard, who, together with units of ground forces, very effectively erase enemy equipment and the occupiers. Thank you, guys. We are doing everything so that you and all other soldiers have even more opportunities to chase the enemy, and the next weeks will be very important from this point of view. We are working extremely closely with our partners to get more tanks, more armor, more artillery for Ukraine. I would also like to mention our border guards, those who continue strengthening the borders in Sumy region, Chernihiv region and Kharkiv region, despite constant Russian shelling and provocations. In some border areas of our country, terrorists use mortar fire, and there is a constant threat of rocket attacks almost every day. Thank you, guys, for your persistence and endurance. This week it was possible to ensure the continuation of the operation of the grain corridor in the Black Sea. According to the results of 7 days, 28 vessels carrying more than 800,000 tons of foodstuffs left the ports of Odessa, Chernomorsk and Pivdenny. The destinations are Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, Oman, Turkey, China and Ethiopia. Moreover, the ship to Ethiopia with 30,000 tons of wheat on board was chartered by the UN Food Programme. And this is a typical list of countries that consume most of our agricultural exports. It was the example of the Grain Export Initiative by which we showed that the world is capable of guaranteeing stability despite any threats posed by Russia. The world did not succumb to Russian blackmail. Key actors acted decisively, and as a result, the aggravation of the food crisis was avoided. This is one of the most significant international results for the entire autumn. When the world is united, terrorists stand no chance. Another proof of the power of real world unity is the work of our charity platform, United 24. Today is exactly 6 months after its launch. Nearly $220 million received in donations from millions of people of more than 100 countries. Drones, helicopters, demining machines are being brought for Ukraine. In particular, the very effective armed truck machines, dozens of ambulance vehicles that are already used in the front areas. Star ambassadors joined the project: Andriy Shevchenko, Elena Svitolina, Alexander Rusik, Demna, Leah Schreiber, Mark Hamill, Imagine Dragons, Barbara Streisand, Scott Kelly and Timothy Snyder. I thank every United 24 donor and ambassador, the project team and everyone who helps us defend ourselves against Russian terror. And by the way, next week we will launch another fundraising direction. We will raise funds for a fleet of marine drones. I think absolutely everyone understands what this is and what it is needed for. And I am sure that millions of people will support this direction in our defense. Everyone has already seen how it works. And this is only for the protection of our marine water area. We claim nothing that does not belong to us. Glory to all who fight and work for Ukraine. Glory to every our hero. Glory to Ukraine.